I just have lunch.
Yeah, it's okay. All right, let's get started. So, um, so what we're gonna do today, there's a slight change in our plans. Last time we went over some chapters from the College Panda textbook, and then we sort of went over the questions we from the writing section of the
Yeah.
actual test you took. But as I looked through some of the other questions that you missed, I felt like a lot of the questions you missed come from topics of grammar that we didn't cover yet.
Mhm.
So what I plan to do, um, we're gonna try to go through as much chapters of this textbook as we can,
Mhm.
and we're going to try to boost your grammar skills as much as possible. Um,
Okay.
and then, um, since normally these practice questions that come after each um, chapter on the textbook is for practice, um, I felt like along with that, we can also um, go over the questions you got wrong as I guess practice for each of the grammar lessons we have too. So for today, um, I'm sort of debating whether we should go over the homework because I'm
Okay.
assuming that you did it,
Mhm.
and if you
Yeah.
have the textbook, um, since I sent it to you, the answers are already there. So
Yeah.
I feel like using our class time to go over that homework may not be the best use of our time. So
I can send you a screenshot if you wish.
yeah, I feel like instead of going them over one by one,
Mhm.
what we can do, we can have you since the answers are there. I'm gonna tell you to grade your own homework, and then
Okay.
come next time with any questions. Like if you got any of the questions wrong, we can go over them together because they only show you the answers, right? They don't really explain it to you. They don't explain you why an answer choice is correct or not.
Mhm.
So for the homework, just grade them yourself, and whichever one you got wrong, or whichever one you want to go over together, you could come next time. We can go over that. Okay. So what we're going to do, we're going to try to go over at least 3 chapters from this um, textbook today. Yeah, that'll be the main focus for today. We'll power through as much grammar as you can because that way you'll be prepared for when we actually start going over the questions you missed. Think of the test you took a couple weeks ago as like a practice diagnostic test to see how good you are right now. And then after we go over the grammar rules and some of the ideas, we'll go back and see how much you've improved. But
Okay.
an important part of this is to make sure you understand everything that I'm talking about. If there's
Mhm.
anything that you don't understand, you have to tell me right away. Otherwise, I'll skip it and go over it. So, and this only works if you follow with follow me and then power through everything with me. Okay.
Mhm.
So just keep in mind if there's anything you don't understand, you have to ask right away. Otherwise, I'm just going to move on.
Okay.
Okay. So chapter 5, because we did chapter 3 and 4 yes, or last time I think. Chapter
Mhm.
5 is about idioms, which I think is perhaps one of the hardest chapters within grammar. And that's because there's no set rule, there's no guidelines you can use to identify or use idioms, because these are fixed and definite series or sets of or phrases or words that's used that doesn't really quite make sense, but you have to learn and memorize anyway. Unlike some of the other grammar rules we learn, um, like I said, you have to memorize it. Otherwise, you can't get any of the questions correct. If an idiom question shows up on the writing section, you either know it or you don't. You can't use any of the rules or grammar rules to solve your way out of it. So, in that sense, idioms are quite hard. But if you're good at memorization, um, this is going to be easy. But only if you're good at memorization.
Mm-hmm.
So, first thing, what is an idiom? Like they explain here, idioms are phrases that are correct just because that's the way we say them. We have some examples here. Normally when you say when you're riding in a bus, you say you're in a bus, right? But in English, we just say I'm on a bus because that's just the way it is. There's no real reason on why we say like this. It's just we just say like this because it's correct. So they included some nice visuals to help you try to understand or try to memorize some of these idioms. But most of the time, you just have to memorize them. Memorize the certain situations where idioms are used. Yeah. So let's go over some other examples. They give you a lot of examples here. Example 1. He is regarded to be an awesome speaker, which is wrong. When someone is regarded, you say regarded as. Same thing with the word similar here. You have to say it's similar to something, not similar with something.
Similar with?
Similar with is wrong because
Yeah.
there's no real reason why it's wrong. And again, that's one of the reasons why idioms are hard. And for example, if I were to cross this off, pretend you didn't see this, and you just read the sentence, she's suspicious towards me. If someone who's never, someone who's not experienced with English read the sentence, they might say, okay, there's nothing wrong with that sentence, right? But in this case, the correct idiomatic use of the word suspicious is suspicious of, not suspicious towards. Right? Notice how there's no real explanations between each example, right? They just give you a bunch of examples, right? Normally before we see an example and we have all of these explanations, right? Prepositional phrases must have a preposition noun and an attached describing phrase, all of these details. But for idioms, there's none of that because that's just the way it is. You just have to know. Again, we see here, there's no rhyme or reason behind these phrases. Now, they actually use another idiom here, rhyme or reason. And there's a lot of these idioms that make no sense, right? For example, the elephant in the room, there's the cat's out of the bag. If you don't know what these idioms mean, there's no way to like figure out what they mean, right? When you say the elephant in the room, it's referring to something, an issue or situation that you can't ignore. Right. For example, if you walk into a room, and someone is dying, right? That's an issue that you can't ignore. But if everyone in the room is sort of ignoring that problem, someone can say, okay, let's address the elephant in the room. Yeah, the cat's out of the bag. It means a secret has been released, I guess. There's a whole bunch of these idioms that make no sense, but you just have to stick through it and memorize it. And these examples here, I'm going to have you do them for homework, but there's a lot of these exercises actually, right? There's 15 plus another 15, so 30 in total, right? So these are going to be 30 idioms that you might not know. And what I recommend, try to go through them without any help. I guess I'll do the first one.
I think it should be about instead of towards.
Right. That's what you would think, right?
Yeah.
But in this case, let me check if it's correct. But I'm pretty sure it's supposed to be of your opinion of me.
Yeah. Yeah. Of me or about.
Yeah.
I think of. Yeah.
Let me check real quick. Sorry, I should have pulled this up earlier. Yeah, it's of. So again, there's no real reason why it's your opinion of and not opinion towards, but you just have to memorize it, right?
Mm-hmm.
So for homework, I want you to try going through all 30 of these questions and come back next time with your wrong answers or questions that you want to go over together. And then, yeah, you just have to memorize them, stick through them. In that sense, it's pretty simple because all you have to do is memorize, right? But then again, there's 30 of these to memorize, right? And you're not even sure if they're going to show up on the test or not, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah. So that was idioms. Chapter 6. Now we get to some of the more fundamental rules of grammar. Something that you probably already know and you're probably doing without much thinking. So yeah, let's get to it. So subject-verb agreement is basically conjugating verbs. I'm not sure what languages you speak, but I'm pretty sure that in all of the languages we speak, there is a conjugated verb, or at least the ones related to English or Latin. For instance, when someone says you is smart, you obviously know that's incorrect, right?
Yeah.
And it's supposed to be you are correct, right? And the issue that's wrong with this is that the subject and the verb disagree because is and are the same verb, right? But they're meant to be used for different subjects, right?
Yeah.
You is a special case because you is singular, right? It's only referring to one thing, but it's using a verb that actually implies more than one person, right? Because normally you say they are smart, we are smart when you're referring to multiple people, right? But you is special because it uses verbs that are plural, or in this case, yeah. Hopefully that makes some sense. Right. This is what I'm talking about. We wakes up is wrong, but we wake up is correct, right?
Yeah.
Wakes and wake are used for different subjects, and the reason why we're going over this is because it gets really complicated when you can't identify your subject and verb. When your sentences get really complicated, you might be confused on what's actually your subject and what's actually your verb, which can lead to you getting answers incorrect. So just like some of the previous chapters where we learned to cross off the non-important information, you sort of have to apply something similar here. Okay. So here they just define what a subject and a verb is. I'm going to assume that you know what it is. See, this is what I was talking about. They're not going to give you easy questions like this, right? They're going to intentionally try to trick your ear, try to trick you, right? Look at this, for example. How do we know which verb we need to use, right? Because if you think that the subject is investigations, that's plural, right?
Yeah.
But if you think the subject is the scandal, it's singular, right? So identifying the subject here is very, very important here because it changes the entire structure of the verb, right?
Yeah.
So what's actually so the secret behind subject-verb agreement in this case is identifying the subject. You have to be really good at identifying the subject, or else this whole chapter is going to be very difficult. Okay, to pick the right verb, we must find the subject. Yep, that's what we talked about. Okay, so now we're applying something we learned in the previous lessons, which is crossing out prepositional phrases, right? We learned this, and you did your homework, I'm assuming, about crossing out prepositional phrases. We did some examples in class. Now we're using that in this chapter, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so from the chapter on prepositional phrases, we know that into the scandal is a prepositional phrase because of the word into, right? If you remember the squirrel and tree situation that I gave you last time, you know that the squirrel can go into the tree, right? Which means that into could be a preposition, right? And then that was our first rule with the squirrel and tree example. And our second rule was, if you remember, can it be a sentence by itself, right?
Yeah.
And in this case, into the scandal can't be a sentence by itself. So it fulfills both of our questions, meaning that it is a prepositional phrase, right? Okay. So once we cross off this prepositional phrase, I think it's very clear to see what our subject is, right? It's investigations, right?
Yeah.
Now, because it has an S, right? This is pretty simple stuff. It has to be a plural, right? More than one. And, right, because it's plural, we have to pick show, right? Without the S. Right? I hope you know why we pick show instead of shows, because it's plural.
Yeah, I got it.
Okay, right. So if you're unsure whether a verb such as show is singular or plural, test it by putting he and they in front of it, and then ask yourself which sounds more correct. Now this relies on your intuition, which is something like your gut feeling, which is something that you believe to be correct, but have no proof, right?
Mm.
Because when you read these two phrases, there should be one that's more obviously correct. They, right? Because you don't say he showed something, right? And this goes back to our subject verb agreement point. But hopefully you can identify which one sounds more correct. Notice how it says sounds, not is, because you're um, relying on your intuition here.
Mhm.
Okay. So again, if you're unsure whether verb is singular or plural, test it by putting he and they, and whichever one sounds more correct. If it's he, it's singular. If it's they, it's plural. Okay. All right. So again, remember the key to subject-verb agreement and the key to this chapter in general is identifying the subject, right? And to identify the subject, we have to get rid of prepositional phrases, right? So let's read this sentence and try to apply the steps we learned. Films by Miyazaki and Itami, including Miyazaki's Spirited Away, the imagination, there's something, the imagination, right? Now, getting rid of prepositional phrases. Now, they tell you the answer here. All right, you got to get rid of by Miyazaki and Itami, and you also have to get rid of including Miyazaki's Spirited Away, right? And hopefully, you did enough practice to understand why these are prepositional phrases. And by now, you should be able to identify prepositional phrases as soon as you read the sentence. Right? If you can't just yet, I recommend try to do more practice or do more questions regarding prepositional phrases, because prepositional phrases are something that you cannot avoid. As you see already, we're not that far into this book, but it's coming up over and over again, right? So if you're basically, I guess you can think of it as fundamentals or basics. If you don't know the basics, then you can't go into more complex topics. So make sure you know prepositional phrases and how to identify them, when to cross them off. Okay. Once we cross off these prepositional phrases, we're left with films blank the audience, or films blank the imagination. Right? Subject is films, which is plural. So we know we have to pick excite, because films excite the audience imagination is more correct than films excites the imagination.
Yeah.
Okay. So going step by step here, right? So there's more examples down there, but we'll only do these two examples, example 4, and then we'll move on. At any point, if you have a question, if you're not sure about something, interrupt me and you can ask me a question, okay? All right. Question is, her jewelry, in addition to her Pokemon cards, blank stolen by the robber. Right? Again, we're crossing off prepositional phrases, in addition, and to her Pokemon cards, prepositional phrase. And also, by the robber is also a prepositional phrase, because by and in this case, in addition, are prepositions here. Now we're left with the basic sentence, her jewelry was or were stolen. And now it's very easy to tell what our subject is, which is her jewelry. and therefore it's very easy to tell what our verb has to be. This case was. Okay, so hopefully you're getting the hang of this by now. Again, I'll repeat it. The key to subject-verb agreement is identifying the subject. To identify the subject, you have to identify prepositional phrases. And to go one step further, to identify prepositional phrases, you have to identify prepositions. You identify prepositions by memorizing them. I mean, you don't necessarily have to memorize them, right? You can use the squirrel and tree example that we talked about. But if you happen to have them memorized, these will come much more easily. All right, let's see. There are a lot of other examples here, right? So what I recommend you do, wow, there's a lot of examples. What I recommend you do is do these examples, do these exercises, these example questions. And if you have trouble with them, let's say if you get more than half of these questions wrong, I want you to go back, start from example 5, and then read each of these steps. How did they get from step 1 to step 2? How did they get from step 2 to step 3? Right? And all of the examples, they have the same steps. First is crossing out prepositional phrases. Right. First step, cross out prepositional phrases. Second, identify the subject. Third, identify the verb to use with the subject. So when you're doing these example questions, I want you to try using these three-step process to help you find your subject. And once you find your subject and your verb, the rest should be pretty simple. All right. Okay. So we're going to skip over all of these examples. Again, if you need any help, you can contact me. But I recommend you try to read through all this information that's given to you. But I'm going to move on because there's a lot of chapters we need to go through. We're 1/10 of the way there, so that was chapter 6, subject-verb agreement. Okay, so we're actually given a passage, right, as an exercise, and you get a whole bunch of identifying subjects and verbs. So don't let this catch you off guard. Remember to repeat the 3-step process. First, crossing out prepositional phrases. Second, identifying the subject. And third, identifying the verb that goes along with the subject. Make sure you have those 3 steps in mind. Also keep in mind how to recognize a prepositional phrase. And once you do that, everything else is pretty simple. Especially within this chapter. Once you know the steps, it just becomes simple. So make sure you don't forget. Okay. Modifiers. This is very important. I think similar to the last chapter, it builds off of what you already know, and it shows up a lot in the SAT. So just like subject-verb agreement, you have to know this. It's a fundamental skill. this goes back to what I tried to teach you on our very first writing session. I kind of failed because I didn't have concrete lesson guide to help me, but this time we'll get it right. When you read the sentence, after being beaten and deflated, the baker shaped and seasoned the dough, right? They try to ask you what's funny about the sentence. And what's funny about the sentence is that I want you to ask yourself, what is being beaten and deflated? Is it the baker that's being beaten and deflated? Or is it the dough that's being beaten and deflated?
I think it's the writer's opinion.
Sorry?
Uh, writer's opinion.
Right. This one?
Yeah, so.
Right. And that's correct. The implied subject for that's being beaten and deflated is the dough, right? But this sentence implies that it's actually the baker and not the dough. And the reason why this is, we'll get into in just a little bit. See, what a modifier is, it's something that changes or goes into more detail about someone or something in the same sentence, right? And this sentence is an example of a misplaced modifier. This phrase here, after being beaten and deflated, is a modifier because it changes the ultimate description of whatever it's talking about. And the reason why it's misplaced is because of a fundamental rule. Modifiers go right next to the thing it's supposed to modify. This is a fundamental rule of modifiers. They must go right next to the thing it's supposed to modify. And you'll see that this modifier, which is supposed to be modifying the dough, isn't next to each other, right? What's next to this modifier? It's the baker,
Yeah.
right? And therefore, it's actually the baker that's being modified and not the dough, right? Hopefully that makes sense.
Yeah.
Fundamental rule. Modifiers go next to the thing it's supposed to modify. You cannot forget this. Very, very important rule here. Now, another thing is identifying modifiers. What is a modifier and what isn't a modifier, right? And a modifier is something like a describing phrase, right? How do you know whether something is a modifier? Usually, like they say here, it comes at the beginning of a sentence and is separated by a comma, but not always. Like they say here, if you read the phrase after being deflated, your natural thought would be who or what is being beaten, right? If I were to get rid of this second half of the sentence, and you're only given this, you're not given the subject, okay? What are we talking about here? We don't know what we're talking about here, right? And like they say here, without the rest of the sentence, it leaves you wondering what's being talked about, right? Yeah. Also, I guess another important way to identify modifiers is to see if your image of the subject changes with and without the modifier. Let's take, for example, this correct sentence we have. Hello? Hello? Can you hear me? Hello? Hello?
Hello.
All right, sorry about that. I think
Um,
my I
I
think my internet disconnected there.
so did mine.
Oh, wow. Okay. But it's fine. Let's continue. All right. What were we talking about? Okay, modifiers. Um, right. We talked about how we identify modifiers, whether it changes your perception of the subject. Right. That's what we were talking about. Um, when you read this sentence here, um, without this modifying phrase, you just have the dough was shaped and seasoned by the baker. Right? Pretty plain sentence. And with just this information, uh, we don't really know much about the dough, right? All we know is that it's a dough. But when we're given this modifying phrase, we're given a much more descriptive idea about what the dough actually is, right? So in this case, you can imagine a dough that was beaten and deflated, probably after the baker prepared it, right? Before, all we can imagine about the dough is not much, right? But now with this modifying phrase, we're given a lot more details about it. And because our perception, our understanding of what the dough actually is changes because of this modifier, we can actually know that it's a modifier. And yeah, I'll give you some examples as we explore some of these. Okay. I bought a house from the local bakery made of gingerbread. Now, what's wrong with this phrase? Um, what's wrong with this phrase is because it's under the assumption that the local bakery is made of gingerbread, right? Instead, what we're actually meaning is I bought a gingerbread house, right, from the local bakery, in which they, uh, in the correct sentence, it actually says, I bought a house made of gingerbread from the local bakery, right? So in this case, our modifier is made of gingerbread.
Uh,
And the
Sir,
subject,
can you explain what's the modifier again?
okay, sure. Because, um, so some of the rules that they give us to identify a modifier is usually it comes at the beginning of a sentence and is separated off by a comma, but not always. Sometimes is a big thing, big word here, because as you see here, in this case, none of these two ideas fit here, right? Because in this case, the modifier is made of gingerbread, right? But made of gingerbread doesn't begin the sentence, and there's no comma separating it, right? So then how can I identify it then? This will be our number 2 rule. Number 1 rule applies for all situations. The modifier changes your perception of the subject. For instance, okay, I feel like I might need to do a bit more explaining, so I'm going to pull up a whiteboard. Okay, so let's say we have the phrase, let's see, what should we do? I go to school I go to school by 7:30. Right. Let's say another sentence is Actually, that's a bad example. I went to the supermarket yesterday. This is our first question, our first sentence, and our second sentence is I went to supermarket on top of the mountain yesterday. Okay. With these two sentences, there's going to be a modifier here. And like I mentioned, the first rule that applies for all modifiers is that it changes your perception of the subject. So whatever the subject is, the modifier changes your perception of it, right? So with the modifier and without the modifier, your belief, your image, your understanding of the subject changes. How you view your subject changes. What I mean by that is, if I just say I went to the supermarket yesterday, you might have some questions. For example, where is the supermarket? Or when did you, like what time exactly did you go to the supermarket? How big is the supermarket? Things like that, right? Our second sentence, I went to the supermarket on top of the mountain yesterday, answers one of those questions. Where is the supermarket, right? With the phrase on top of the mountain, you're given a much more precise, much more accurate understanding of the supermarket. Right? Can you see how those two sentences are different? How the first one, it's kind of more vague, but the second one is much more precise, much more accurate, and it gives you a better understanding of the subject. Can you see that?
Mm-hmm.
And can you see how the modifier, which is on top of the mountain in this case, changes your perception of the subject?
Yeah.
This is what I mean when I say it changes your perception. I mean it in the sense that you're given more information about it.
Yeah.
It answers one of the questions of who, what, when, where, or how. I guess here, let's actually go back to our examples. And let's try to identify it. I'm going to show you, okay, a wrong example. I'm purposely covering up the correct example here. Watching the end of the world, our lives flash before our eyes. Okay. Actually, it might be better to show you a correct version first. Okay. Yeah, this is going to be better. I bought a house made of gingerbread from the local bakery. Okay, we're trying to identify the modifier here, right? And we know that it's supposed to be made of gingerbread. And in this case, imagine a house, right? Let's say we didn't have this. We didn't have made of gingerbread. Let's say you just said, I bought a house from the local bakery. That makes no sense, right?
Yeah.
How can you buy an entire house from a local bakery, right?
Mhm.
But with the phrase made of gingerbread, it makes much more sense, right? Your entire perception of this house changes. Instead of a house that you live in, right, that you buy, like some sort of a building or a mansion, now it turns into a much more smaller, an edible version of a house, right?
Yeah.
And because this modifier changes this perception of your subject, that's why it's a modifier, right? And you might say, okay, so then um, why isn't from the local bakery a modifier? Um, in this case, we have to consider the sense of scale or magnitude. Imagine this sentence without this phrase. Let's say you just say, I have a house made of gingerbread. Obviously, when you're given this modifier from the local bakery, like I said, it does change your perception of the subject, right? You're given a much more precise um, understanding because you're saying you bought this gingerbread house from a local bakery, not just anywhere, right? Not a supermarket, not from, I don't know, not from like a website. You bought it from a local bakery, right? In this case, it does change your perception of your subject, right?
Yeah.
But which of the two modifiers change your perception more, right? And in this case, it's this modifier made of gingerbread. What I mean by that is before, when made of gingerbread was the main modifier, we from a literal house that people live in, the subject changes from the subject changes from a literal house that people live in to a very tiny edible house, right? And with from the local bakery as the modifier, the subject, which is the gingerbread house, only changes slightly because you're only given the location of where you bought it from. So your perception of the subject here changes a lot more when made of gingerbread is the modifier. Hopefully that makes some sense.
Yeah.
Okay. So example one is sort of tricky because it sort of ignores the rule that they set, right? That modifiers are placed at the beginning of the sentence and are separated by commas. So again, first rule, second rule, These are the two fundamental rules to identifying a modifier, right? First, you should see if your modifier changes your perception of the subject. When you're given a sentence without any modifiers, without like it definitively telling you what is a modifier, the way you identify it, first, pick a random phrase or a likely phrase that you think is a modifier. And to check if it is, see if the modifier changes your perception of the subject. And if it does, it could be a modifier. If it doesn't, move on to the next step. Is it separated by commas and placed at the beginning of the sentence? If the answer is yes, then it's highly likely that it is a modifier. And then see if your modifier fits your subject. I'll explain what I mean by that. In example 2, in the wrong example, watching the end of the world, our lives flash before our eyes. Using our first rule, or in this case, you can go straight to the second rule. Watching the end of the world is our phrase, right? In this case, it's placed at the beginning of the sentence, right? And it's also separated by commas. So we know that that has to be a modifier, right? Now ask yourself, what is it modifying? In the wrong example you see at the top, what is that modifier modifying?
There's no modifier.
Sorry, can you say that again?
There's no modifier, I think.
Okay. Remember our rule, one of the first very fundamental rules of modifiers. Modifiers are the subject that the modifier changes should be placed right next to each other. Go back. Modifiers go right next to the thing it's supposed to modify. Right? So in order to identify the subject of a modifier, in order to identify what the modifier is actually modifying, you have to look right next to the modifier. What word comes right next to the modifier? What subject comes right next to the modifier? Right? In example 2, we identified the modifier to be watching the end of the world. Okay? And in order to identify what it's modifying, we have to look right next to it. Right? So what subject is right next to watching the end of the world?
Our lives.
Exactly. And in this case, that's exactly right. That modifier is modifying our lives. And I want you to ask yourself, can your life watch the end of the world? And the very obvious answer is no. Does your life have eyes? No, you have eyes, but your life doesn't. Right? And they do say this here. The sentence makes no sense because our lives don't have eyes to watch the end of the world. Right? Because you, or in this case, we are the ones that are watching the end of the world, right? Not our lives. And that's why this sentence at the top is wrong. Because again, modifier is misplaced. It's not next to the subject it's supposed to modify, right? So I guess there are two fundamental lessons to be learned here. Two main skills that we need to learn. First is identifying the modifier. And I give you two fundamental rules to help you identify modifier, right? So that should be okay. Our second skill is seeing what subject our modifier is changing. And to do that, again, we have to look right next to the modifier. Yeah, those are two main skills. And if you can do those two skills, you mastered this chapter. So let's go to example 3. I'm going to hopefully cover the correct answer. Right, we have this rule here. Keep modifiers right next to the thing it's supposed to modify to describe. So let's look at example 3 and solve our way through this. First, identifying the modifier. Here's your two rules to identify modifier. Changes the perception of the subject, and it comes at the beginning of a sentence separated by commas sometimes. Right? And in this case, we use rule number 2 because this phrase here, it's at the beginning of a sentence, check, right? And it's also separated by commas. Okay, we have this comma here.
Yeah.
So right away, we know that this phrase is a modifier. Running fiercely to the bathroom. Right? Now, our next step is to identify what the modifier is referring to. And to do that, we use our rule. Modifiers are placed next to the subject it's supposed to modify, right? So in this sentence, it's wrong because this modifier here, the subject that it's modifying in this example is John's pants. Now, I want you to ask yourself, can John's pants run fiercely to the bathroom? Right? And obviously the answer is no, because John's pants are inanimate, right? They're not alive. They can't run, right? Your pants can't run, right?
Yeah.
And as funny as it sounds, that's exactly why our sentence is wrong. Because again, it's a misplaced modifier. The modifier is not next to the subject it's supposed to modify. Now, we identified that it's incorrect, but now we have to identify what the correct subject should be. And in this case, the correct subject should be John. Right? So, there are two main ways to fix the sentence so it's correct. We have our first choice, which is this fixes our issue of misplaced modifiers, right? And our second way to fix it is to keep this format, but have the correct subject right next to the modifier. you'll see in for our second way to fix it, it keeps our modifier at the beginning of the sentence, right? And it's also continued to be separated by a comma, right? The only thing that changes is the subject that comes right after the modifier, which is John instead of John's pants, okay? Now it makes much more sense because John can run fiercely to the bathroom, right? But John's pants can't run fiercely to the bathroom, which is why the sentence is wrong. Okay?
Oh yeah.
And let's take a look at the correct example. Okay, so in this example, they used our second one, keeping the same format, right? Running fiercely to the bathroom, John drops his pants. But I want you to know that this first option is also correct.
Oh yeah.
Now, okay, now I'm going to go over example number 4, but in a much quicker pace than example 3. And this is how, I guess I'm showing you how good you should be at identifying these misplaced modifiers. So when you finish all these exercises, you should be able to fix these sentences as quickly as me, right? First, let's read our sentence. Spotted dealing cocaine, the police arrested the drug dealers. The problem with this is that our modifier, which is spotted dealing cocaine, does not fit with the subject, which is the subject in this case. The intended subject is the drug dealers. Therefore, we have two main options to fix this like last time. First, we can change the formatting of the sentence and say, our second way to fix it, just like last time, is to keep the correct format, but to change the subject that comes after the modifier. And judging from the way this textbook dealt with our previous example, I'm going to say they went with the second option. Okay, so they actually went with a different route, which is actually shorter than, is it shorter? I guess they're about the same, right? But they did choose another way to fix this sentence. Now you'll see that it's very similar to this first sentence we see here, right?
Yeah.
It's almost exactly the same. It's just that one word was changed and a comma was added.
Yeah. Bless you.
Thank you. We'll go into more detail, hopefully, on the nuances between the difference between these two. Because I'll say this right now, there is a difference between these two sentences. But hopefully we'll go over it later on when that chapter shows up. But for now, sticking with modifiers. Okay. So again, this book is filled with examples, right? So again, what I'm going to recommend you do, tackle these exercises on your own. See if you can answer them. And what I recommend you do, answer half of these. You see, the first set of exercises has 21 questions. So what I recommend you do, answer the first 10. Check your answers and correct the ones you got wrong. Read this part again. And then tackle the rest. And then tackle 11 through 21. That way, instead of answering all of them at once, you'll get more of an understanding of how misplaced modifiers work. So again, when you're checking over your incorrect answers, use your thought process like they do in the example here. Like I did, identify the modifier, identify the subject that the modifier changes, and identify what the correct subject should be. Okay. Okay, so these are practical questions that can actually show up on your SAT test. These questions are formatted to be in a way that could actually show up on the test. And I'm going to guarantee you that the questions you got wrong on some of the writing questions that you first took have to do with modifiers. And if you can master this, you're going to get a whole lot of questions more correct. You're going to reduce your incorrect questions by a lot. Modifiers are a really, really big part of SAT writing. And just by mastering this one small skill, I'm going to guarantee you, you're going to get at least 4 or 5 questions more right next time.
Okay.
So really, really focus on doing these exercises. Make sure any question you get wrong, you understand 100% why you got that wrong. A lot of the times when students see an incorrect answer, they think, oh, well, better luck next time. It was, well, I made a small mistake. I'll get it right next time. But that never happens. You never get it right next time. So whenever you get an incorrect answer, make sure you understand 100% why that answer is wrong. If you can't understand it, you can come ask me, send me a message, or you can try to read some of these examples again. Remember the rules. Remember how to identify a modifier. Remember how to identify the correct subject that the modifier changes. And with those steps, I think you'll get this.
Okay.
Okay. Yeah, this exercise 2, this is going to be really, really helpful. Because again, questions that are almost exactly like this are guaranteed to show up in the test. 100%. So this is really, really good practice. Oh, good. They give you a lot more. Okay. Run-on sentences. Okay. This is also very important. And it's also very easy. I don't know why people have trouble with this. It's just, I think it's basically just one rule you need to keep in mind. And it's easy points. Whenever this shows up on your writing, you'll be happy because it's going to be easy points once you understand how this works. Most students think they know what a run-on is based on their 6th grade English class. So when I ask students whether the following is a run-on sentence, almost all students say yes. I took the SATs, I scored a 36, and I applied to MIT and I got in. This sentence is not a run-on sentence because it's grammatically correct. And the reason why, it's because of the use of the word and, which strings all of these ideas together. You'll actually see that this sentence right here is a run-on sentence, but this is not. So to understand why, first let's understand the very basics, because these two examples are examples that are quite advanced from a regular run-on sentence. You're introduced to right away to a way you can identify a run-on when several complete sentences are being mashed together with just commas. It is a run-on sentence. Now, there are two forms of a run-on sentence. When two sentences are mashed together with a comma, and when two sentences are mashed together without a comma. Now, when you see a run-on sentence, a lot of the questions on the SAT writing are going to give you choices on how you fix a run-on sentence. So it's important for you to understand the different ways you can fix a run-on sentence. First, use a period. So you separate two complete sentences, or you separate two complete sentences that are mashed into one into two separate sentences. Instead of saying he was hungry, he bought a burrito, you say he was hungry, he bought a burrito. Now, the second way is using a conjunction. And what a conjunction is, it's a list of words that are used to separate, I guess, to make run-on sentences grammatically correct. And when I was in, I don't know, elementary school, there was a way you remember all these acronyms. I don't know if you learned this, but it's fanboys. Now, this is an acronym, and each word stands for a conjunction. And the reason why we say the word fanboys is to help you memorize these list of conjunctions. Some of these you'll be very familiar with, and, but, or. Some of these not so much. For, nor, yet. You might not have seen this used as conjunctions. But it's important for you to keep in mind these list of conjunctions. And the way you properly fix a run-on with a conjunction is to use a comma before fanboys, right?
Yeah.
You can only correct a run-on sentence if you want to, I guess, fix a run-on sentence. If you connect words that are not from the fanboys list, it's still a run-on. You can only use the words from the fanboys list to correct run-ons if you want to use them in the first place. This is why this sentence is incorrect, because therefore is not a word in our fanboys list, right? So it can't be used to separate two complete sentences with a comma. So remember this list of conjunctions with the word fanboys. Now, another way to fix run-ons is a semicolon. You'll see semicolon is like half of a colon, right? I mean, I'm sure you've seen these before, and it's probably one of the easiest ways to fix it, because all you have to do is just slap it in between two complete sentences, and it becomes a correct sentence. You'll see before we said we said that this was a grammatically incorrect sentence. We said that this was a run-on sentence. But now, this is a grammatically correct sentence. Now you might be saying, what? How can this be? Right? And the reason why is because this idea is composed of two main sentences. He was hungry. Second, therefore, he bought a burrito. Now, what this first sentence did was they mashed it together with only a comma, right? You'll see that both of these sentences are complete, right? He was hungry is a complete sentence. Therefore, he bought a burrito is a complete sentence. But because they mashed it together with a comma, it can't be grammatically correct because it's a run-on. Because you're combining two complete sentences without using a fanboys or a semicolon, right?
Yeah.
So instead, if you use a semicolon, like this question or sentence 2, then it becomes grammatically correct. Do not use both a conjunction and a semicolon, because semicolons require a complete sentence on both sides. These two, you'll see, are not complete sentences. He was hungry is a complete sentence, but and he bought a Chipotle burrito is not a complete sentence. And therefore, you can't use a semicolon because a semicolon requires complete sentences on both sides. Okay. Now let's move on to our fourth way of fixing a run-on. So the fourth way is fixing the sentence so that it's no longer two complete sentences. Fix it so that one's a complete sentence and one is an incomplete sentence. And we categorize these into two main, okay, so this goes into a lot more detail than what I'm about to teach. But all it's saying is that there's a lot of ways to change a complete sentence into an incomplete sentence. Now they go into all of these details, right? About ways you could change a complete sentence into an incomplete sentence. But the reason why I'm not going to go over this is because you're not going to be asked to write down a complete, I guess what I'm trying to say, you're not going to be asked to rewrite a run-on into a way so that you have two, so that you don't have two complete sentences. What that basically means, because the SAT is multiple choice, you're going to be given options. So as long as you can identify which options have a complete sentence and an incomplete sentence, you'll be fine. As long as you can identify that in this sentence, that this first part is a complete sentence and that this second part is an incomplete sentence, you'll be fine. So let me ask you this. Can you see why this is an incomplete sentence by itself? Can you see that?
There's no subject. Yeah.
Right. As long as you can see that this is an incomplete sentence, you'll be fine. Because now, before, we had two complete sentences that were separated by a comma. But now we don't. We have a complete sentence and we have an incomplete sentence separated by a comma, which is why now it's a grammatically correct sentence because it's not a run-on anymore.
Yeah.
And we have A, B, and C, and I'm guessing D and E, right? But I'm telling you, as long as you can identify complete and incomplete sentences, you'll be fine. This first part is a complete sentence, and the second part is not a complete sentence. And as long as you can identify why the second part is not a complete sentence, you'll be fine. That's basically what I'm saying. And as long as you can do that, you'll be able to solve these examples or these questions I'm going to assume. So that was a lot of information about run-ons. So we just went over 4 possible ways you can fix a run-on sentence, right? That was a lot of information and a lot of different ways you can fix it. So they did a pretty nice thing here, and they gave you a couple of reminders for run-ons, right? If there's already a conjunction, or if we're not connecting two complete sentences in the first place, then there is no error. Although the plan was perfect, the clumsy criminals, who by now would have been millionaires, are locked in jail cells, slowly waiting out their sentences. Looking at where the commas are, at no point are we trying to combine two complete sentences on either side, so the sentence is completely fine. What that means, there's a lot of commas used here. There's one used here, there's one used here, there's one used here, there's one used here, right? No matter at which point you decide to split the sentence, let's say I decide to split the sentence right here. At no point is it going to form two complete sentences on either side of this break. If I decide to split it here, we have one sentence, although the plan was perfect, the clumsy criminals, sentence 1, and we have sentence 2, which is who by now would have been millionaires are locked in jail cells, slowly weighing out their sentences. At no point will we have two complete sentences on either side. Let's say I decided to split it here. It's also not going to produce two complete sentences on either side. Again, if I split it here, at no point will it have two complete sentences on either side. That's what it's saying. Okay, so that was the first reminder, right? And our second reminder is never use more than one way of correcting a run-on with the same sentence. Don't use a semicolon with a conjunction, and don't use a conjunction with a dependent clause. The following examples are all incorrect. This first one is incorrect because you're using both a semicolon and a conjunction, right? Remember, and is a conjunction because it's a part of our fanboys list, right? You should only use one of these two. You should either use only a semicolon without and, or you should use and without a semicolon and a comma. Second one is wrong. Even though the coffee in Rome is amazing, but I still like Starbucks more. the reason why this is wrong is because that even without this conjunction here, this sentence would be complete. Even though the coffee in Rome is amazing, I still like Starbucks coffee more. That is a complete sentence, right? But by including but, it becomes a run-on sentence. Because remember, conjunctions are used to combine two complete sentences, right? Because in this case, it's actually separating, it's not separating two complete sentences. That's why this is wrong. And a similar rule applies for all of these other sentences. Okay. So again, you're given a bunch of these practice problems. So again, what I recommend you do, there's 16 questions here. So I want you to do the first 8. Check over your answers. At the very end of the textbook, you're given the answers to the practice. And then go over the ones you got wrong. And then do the rest of the exercises. That way you'll be more comfortable with the questions. And you'll be able to get better value of these practice questions. Especially part 3 here, when you're actually giving questions in the format of an actual writing test. This is very, very valuable practice for you because these are given to you in a format that can actually show up on your test. So pretend this is your real SAT writing section and use the skills that I've taught. Use the skills of identifying the run-ons and the practice questions you did up here to answer these to the best of your abilities. Yeah, that's it for today. We got through a lot of these chapters. We got run-ons, right? We got modifiers, we got idioms. So you have a lot of homework for today. And until we finish this entire textbook, you're going to have a lot of homework because we're going to go through a lot of these chapters.
Yeah.
So I want you to continue. Try your best.
Okay.
It's okay if you can't finish all of them. And it might actually be even better if you leave some questions, because as we go on to like chapters 20, 25, you're eventually going to forget some of these earlier chapters, right?
Yeah.
So at that point, it might be good to go back to the questions that you left unanswered to help sharpen your skills again.
Yeah.
Just keep in mind, it's okay not to answer all the questions right now, all the homework questions, but still try your best.
Okay, thank you.
Listen to all the tips, and yeah. That's it for today.